The building had been a textile warehouse before the war. You could still tell. The ceiling was too high for its current purpose, and the walls carried the faint chemical smell of dye and processed cotton beneath the newer smell of concrete, dust, and unwashed people. There were 43 German women inside. Ilse Mayer had counted them twice. She was 28 years old. For the last 19 months, she had worked as a signals interceptor, sitting for long hours with headphones pressed against her skull, pulling language out of noise, turning intercepted transmissions into clean text. She was exceptionally good at this. She had the kind of attention the work required. Total, sustained, without impatience. She had been applying that same attention to the warehouse for 4 days. Renata was sitting beside her on the floor with her back against the wall, reading a paperback novel she had been carrying since Erfurt. She had read it before. Ilse could tell because she was never surprised by anything that happened in it. Renata Scholz was 21 and from a village of 900 people in Thuringia. She had been a radio auxiliary, transmission end, the person who sent what others compiled. She was not analytical the way Ilse was. She was quicker in other ways. Quicker to sense what people meant beneath what they said. The main door opened. The man who entered was American. Sergeant. 30, perhaps. He walked to the center of the room carrying a folded paper and a clipboard, waited for the room to go quiet, and read the transfer order in English first, then in careful German. Transfer to American military custody has been authorized. Transport to the United States will occur within 72 hours. He folded the paper. He looked at the room with no readable expression, not satisfaction, not regret, nothing to interpret, and turned to leave. Renata's voice came from the floor. Where are they taking us? The sergeant stopped. He turned and looked at her. He looked at the paper in his hand, as if checking whether the destination was printed there. Then he closed his mouth and walked out. The door shut. The crossbar came down like a full stop. Somewhere to the left, a woman began to cry. Quietly, into her hands. Ilse sat against the wall and felt something more precise than fear. It was the alertness of someone whose framework is about to be tested against new data, and who already suspects the framework may be the wrong size for what is coming. She knew what the Americans were. She had been told clearly and had accepted it the way she accepted verified information. Efficient. Pragmatic. Their apparent civility was a managed output, calibrated, deliberate, designed to produce a specific return. Their generosity was never generosity in the true sense. It was investment. She believed this. She had believed it long enough that it had the texture of geography. Not opinion. Simply the shape of the ground she was standing on. She looked at the door. He had not refused to answer. He had opened his mouth and found that the answer he had available was not quite the right shape for the question being asked. Renata had closed her book. That was not an answer, she said. No, Ilse said. Why didn't he answer? Because the answer he had was insufficient for the question. Renata looked at her. Is that good or bad? Ilse considered the precise shape of the sergeant's hesitation. I don't know yet, she said. Months into the war's final collapsing stages, she had not said those 4 words together once. She had always known, or constructed a knowing sufficient to proceed on. She was aware, sitting in the warehouse dust, that something in the weight of that sentence was different from anything she had carried before. Outside, the afternoon moved without her. America arrived before Ilse was ready for it. The transport ship had docked at Newport News on a Thursday morning, and the trucks had been waiting on the pier, 6 of them, canvas-covered, engines already running. The transfer had been efficient and unremarkable. No ceremony. The women climbed up, the tailgates closed, and the convoy moved. Ilse sat near the back opening where the canvas didn't quite meet the frame and watched through the gap. The road out of the port was wide and paved and intact. Not intact the way a repaired road is intact. Patched, uneven, carrying the memory of damage in its surface. Intact the way something is when it has never been touched. The asphalt was smooth and continuous, and the painted lines along its edges were bright white and unbroken, and that detail, the bright white lines, unmarked by any of the things that mark roads in countries where the war has actually been, was the first thing that registered as wrong. Not wrong. Ilse corrected herself. Unfamiliar. The country opened up as they drove west. Fields, green and wide under a spring sky that had not yet decided between blue and gray. Small towns with churches and painted storefronts, and people moving through their ordinary Thursdays without reference to the convoy passing through. A gas station with fuel in its tanks. A hardware store with goods in its window. A woman hanging laundry on a line outside a white house, not looking up. Ilsa mapped it as they drove. She could not help it. It was what she did with new terrain. But the map kept requiring revisions, because the scale was wrong. Everything was larger than her internal model had prepared for. The distances between towns. The width of the fields. The size of the sky above the Blue Ridge, which appeared to the west in the early afternoon as a long dark line of mountains running north to south, their ridges beginning to soften with new growth. Renata had pressed her face to the gap in the canvas on the other side. "It's all still there," she said. "Yes," Ilsa said. "Everything. All of it." Renata pulled back from the gap and looked at Ilsa. "How is it all still there?" Ilsa said nothing. She had an answer: the Atlantic, the distance, the strategic decision to keep the industrial base intact. But the answer felt mechanical against the weight of what they were looking at. A country that had been in the war for 3.5 years and showed none of it. No craters in the roads. No gaps in the building lines. No smell. She had lived with the smell of bombed cities for so long that its absence was itself a kind of information, arriving in the lungs as something she had no word for. She looked back through the gap and said nothing. The truck turned north onto a smaller road and climbed gently through farmland and apple orchards in early bloom. White flowers against gray bark, the petals coming down in the light wind and settling on the road in small drifts, and then crested a low hill, and the camp was visible below them in a shallow valley. Ilsa looked at it. The buildings were wooden and plain. A main structure, several smaller ones, what appeared to be a mess hall, a low administrative building near the entrance. A dirt road connecting them. Trees at the perimeter. A flagpole near the center with the American flag moving slowly in the same wind that was carrying the apple blossoms. She looked for the fence. There were wooden rails. Low, horizontal, the kind used for livestock. They marked the perimeter in a rough rectangle and had no wire between them and nothing above them. Beyond the rails the orchard continued. The same apple trees, the same white flowers. As if the boundary existed only as a suggestion, a line someone had drawn to indicate where the camp began and the rest of Virginia did not. No watchtowers. No dogs. No secondary perimeter. The truck stopped. The tailgate came down. The women climbed out into Virginia spring air that smelled of turned earth and apple blossom and something sweet and green that had no equivalent in Dresden in April. Hey, if you're enjoying the content, don't forget to like and subscribe to help the channel grow. Also, I'd love to know which part of the US you're watching from. Let me know in the comments below. Ilsa stood in the dirt with her bag and looked at the rails. Renata appeared beside her, squinting in the afternoon light. She looked at the rails, then at the orchard beyond them, then at the mountains visible to the west above the tree line. Her expression moved through several things quickly. Then she said quietly, "Where's the wire?" A voice to their left said, in English, "Ma'am." Sergeant Henry Calloway was standing 3 meters away. He had apparently heard. He was looking at Renata with an expression that Ilsa could not immediately categorize. Not irritation, not amusement, not the performance of patience. He looked at the rails, then back at Renata, then at the rails again, as if genuinely uncertain what she was seeing that he wasn't. He didn't answer. He turned and said, "This way, please," and walked toward the administrative building. Ilsa picked up her bag. She followed him, and as she passed the first rail she looked at it. Plain wood, weathered gray, set in the ground with the casual permanence of something installed without particular urgency. She looked at the gap between this rail and the next. Beyond it the orchard went on, indifferent and blooming, the petals still coming down in the slow warm air. Nothing between her and the rest of Virginia except the distance. She kept walking. That evening the barracks were quiet after lights out. The bunks had mattresses. The blankets were wool and sufficient. Outside, the Shenandoah Valley was making the sounds of a spring night. Insects, somewhere a creek, the occasional movement of something in the orchard. Renata was in the bunk above. After a while she said into the dark, "We ate tonight." "Yes," Ilsa said. "Real food. Hot food." A pause. "Bread with butter. I haven't had butter since November." Ilsa had noted the food with the precision she applied to everything. The meal had been bean soup, cornbread, a portion of boiled chicken, coffee. The coffee was real, dark and hot, and available in whatever quantity a person wanted. She had drunk 2 cups, and her body had registered the caffeine with the intensity of someone who had been rationed ersatz for a year. She had filed all of it under managed conditions, Geneva compliance, calculated sufficiency. It's not generosity, Ilsa said. It's maintenance. Sufficient conditions to ensure prisoner productivity and compliance with international convention. They need us functional. Renata was quiet for a moment. They gave Sophie a second portion, she said. Without her asking. The woman with the ladle just looked at her and gave her more. Observation of physical condition. Standard practice. Ilsa. Renata said it gently, without argument. She looked at her the way my mother used to look at me when I hadn't eaten enough. Ilsa looked at the ceiling. She had an answer for this too. She kept it to herself, because delivering it a third time in the dark would require her to hear how it sounded, and she was not certain she wanted that information yet. Outside, the orchard moved in the night wind. The rails at the perimeter were invisible in the dark, but present. She could place them precisely. She had measured the distance from the barracks door to the first rail post, and from the first rail post to the tree line. And beyond them the rest of Virginia continued, unenclosed and indifferent, all the way to the mountains and past them. Why no fence? Renata said. Not for the first time. The terrain is the fence, Ilsa said. The distance, the local population, the language barrier. Wire is redundant when the conditions themselves produce compliance. Renata considered this. That's 3 reasons. Yes. You always have 3 reasons when one would do. Ilsa said nothing. My grandmother used to say, Renata said slowly, that a man who explains himself 3 times doesn't believe himself once. The insects continued outside. The creek ran wherever it ran. Somewhere in the orchard a branch moved against another branch with a sound like something trying to find its balance. Ilsa closed her eyes. She was thinking about the rails. About the gap between them and the orchard beyond. About the fact that the gap was real and the terrain was real, and her 3 explanations were all accurate, and somehow still not the right size for what she was looking at. She did not share this thought. She closed her eyes and waited for sleep, which took longer than it should have, in a bunk that was more comfortable than anything she had slept in for 7 months. The work assignment came on the 4th day. Sergeant Calloway appeared at the barracks door at 7 in the morning and read 8 names from his clipboard without looking up. Ilsa's name was among them. So was Renata's. He told them in his careful German that they were assigned to a tobacco cooperative 8 miles east. Daily transport. Supervised work detail. The owner's name was Frank Dunlap. He spoke no German. The truck took them through the valley on a road that ran between fields of dark soil recently turned, the air coming in through the canvas gaps carrying the smell of earth and manure and something green and sharp that Ilsa could not immediately identify. The Blue Ridge was visible to the west the entire drive, its long ridge catching the early light in a way that made the new growth on the slopes appear almost luminescent, a color that had no equivalent in the palette of any city she had lived in. She mapped the route as they drove. She could not help it. The cooperative was a collection of long wooden buildings set back from the road behind a gravel yard. Several curing barns, a sorting shed, a small office building. The smell of cured tobacco reached them before the truck stopped, dense and sweet and particular, a smell that had no context in Ilsa's experience but settled in the back of the throat like something familiar that she couldn't place. Frank Dunlap was waiting in the gravel yard. He was 55 or so, built for sustained physical work rather than speed, with a face that the Virginia sun and wind had organized into a specific geography of lines and angles. He looked at the group of 8 women climbing down from the truck with the expression of a man assessing a work problem, not unkind, not warm, simply practical. He had a task, and they were the resource assigned to help him complete it. He spoke to Calloway briefly. Calloway translated. The women would work in the sorting shed. They would be shown what to do. Quality mattered more than speed in the first days. Questions should be directed to his foreman. That was all. No speech. No welcome. No acknowledgement of the particular circumstances that had brought a group of German women to a Virginia tobacco cooperative in the spring of 1945. Frank Dunlap looked at them the way he would look at any new workers on the first morning, with the focused neutrality of someone who would form his opinions from observation and not before. He turned and walked toward the sorting shed, and they followed. The foreman's name was Wallace. He was perhaps 40, a lean, quiet man who moved through the shed with the efficiency of someone who had worked in the same building for 20 years and had developed an exact relationship with every surface and corner of it. He showed them the work without theatrics. Here is the leaf. Here is how you check the grade. Here is how you bundle. Here is where the finished bundles go. He demonstrated each step once, cleanly, and then stood back and watched them begin. Ilse worked carefully. Precision was not difficult for her. It was her natural register, the mode in which she had always operated most comfortably. Within the first hour, she had understood the grading system, memorized the bundle weight, and developed a rhythm that Wallace observed without comment and then walked away from, which she understood as approval. Renata was at the table to her left. She was slower to find the rhythm, but more instinctive once she had it. Her hands moved with a natural dexterity that the mechanical quality of the work suited. The other workers in the shed were American, local women, mostly, ranging from perhaps 20 to 60, who had been doing this work long enough that conversation and labor occupied different parts of their attention simultaneously. They spoke to each other across the tables in the specific shorthand of people who have worked together for years, a private language of reference and abbreviation that carried a whole history Ilse had no access to. They did not speak to the German women, not with hostility, simply with the practical reserve of people who had been told a situation and were proceeding with it in the way they proceeded with most things, steadily, without drama, waiting to see what developed. The morning passed in the smell of cured leaf and the sound of working hands and Wallace moving through the shed, making small corrections with gestures rather than words. At midday, Calloway appeared and walked them across the gravel yard to the main house. Marge Dunlap had set the long kitchen table for everyone. Ilse stopped in the doorway for a moment and looked at it. The table ran the length of the kitchen, 10 places, perhaps 12. Plates already set. A large pot on the stove. Cornbread in a cast-iron pan on the counter. Coffee on the burner. The window above the sink was open and the smell of the turned fields outside came through it and mixed with the smell of the food in a way that was almost aggressive in its ordinariness. Marge was perhaps 55, compact and deliberate in her movements, with the quality of someone who had been running a large household without assistance for a long time and had made her peace with the scale of the work. She looked at the group coming through the door and said something brief and pointed toward the wash basin near the back door. Hands first. Then sit. They washed their hands. They sat. Marge moved from the stove to the table without ceremony, ladling soup into each bowl in sequence. Wallace, 2 local workers who had come in from the yard, Frank Dunlap himself, and then the German women, same ladle, same portion, without a pause between one category of person and the next. She set the cornbread on the table and went back for the coffee and filled every cup without asking. Ilse looked at her bowl. Bean soup. Thick, with pieces of pork and what she identified as some kind of dark leaf vegetable. She picked up her spoon. Across the table, Renata was looking at Marge's back with the expression she got when she was processing something she hadn't expected. Frank Dunlap said something to Wallace about the afternoon's work. Wallace answered. The 2 local women resumed a conversation that had apparently been interrupted by the walk from the shed to the house. The table was occupied with the sounds of an ordinary meal. Ilse ate her soup and listened and understood more than she let anyone see. She was watching for the calculation behind what Marge was doing. The managed performance of equality, same portions, same table, same coffee, designed to create a specific psychological impression in the prisoners, lower their resistance, increase their cooperation. It was a recognizable technique. She had encountered its description in briefings. She knew what it looked like. The problem was that Marge did not look like someone executing a technique. She looked like someone who fed people because people needed feeding, and that was what the kitchen was for. Ilse kept eating and kept watching and held these 2 possibilities in parallel, technique or simply the way things were done, and could not find the evidence that distinguished one from the other. The afternoon brought a different table arrangement. The German women on one side of the sorting shed, the American workers on the other, the work itself occupying the space between them with a democratic impartiality that made the division seem arbitrary after an hour. It was Clara who crossed it first. She was perhaps 30, with dark hair pulled back and hands that moved through the tobacco leaf with a speed that was almost mechanical. She had been watching Renata's technique for most of the afternoon from across the table without appearing to watch. The sidelong attention of someone evaluating a process without wanting to make the evaluation obvious. Then she put down her own bundle, walked around the table, and stood beside Renata. She didn't say anything. She picked up a handful of leaf from Renata's pile, adjusted the angle of the stems with 2 fingers, and demonstrated how the bundle pulled tighter and held its weight better with the stems aligned rather than crossed. She did it twice, slowly, then handed the leaf back to Renata. Renata tried it. The bundle came together cleanly. Clara nodded once, the nod of someone who has confirmed that the information transferred correctly, and walked back to her side of the table and resumed her own work. The exchange had taken perhaps 45 seconds. Ilse had watched all of it. She waited for what came after. The look back, the comment to the woman beside her, the small social transaction that would indicate the gesture had an audience in mind. Clara said nothing. She looked at nothing except the leaf in front of her. The 45 seconds was complete in itself, offered and finished, with nothing asked in return and nothing added. Ilse placed her next bundle on the pile and thought about the words no audience. A performance required an audience. That was the definition of performance, something done with awareness of being seen. Clara had not checked whether anyone was watching before she walked around the table. She had checked whether Renata's technique was costing her efficiency, and then she had corrected it, the way you correct something that needs correcting. That was either a very convincing performance or no performance at all. Ilse had been arriving at this fork in the road regularly since the transit facility, and each time she arrived at it, she took the same path, technique, calculation, managed output, because the other path had implications she was not prepared to follow to their end. She took the same path again. But she was aware, placing bundle after bundle on the pile in the warm afternoon shed, that the path was becoming harder to walk without noticing the other one. The days acquired a rhythm the way days do when the structure around them is consistent. The bell at 6. The truck at 7. Wallace and the shed and the smell of cured leaf. Marge's kitchen at noon. The drive back in the late afternoon through the valley with the blue ridge going gold in the western light. The barracks. The evening. The night. Ilse accepted the rhythm the way she accepted all systems, by understanding the logic of it and operating inside it without friction. She did not find comfort in it. She told herself she did not find comfort in it. She was not certain this was entirely true, but she was not prepared to examine it closely. What she was prepared to examine, in the evenings on her bunk while the valley settled into its spring dark, was the accumulating list of things she could not file correctly. The list had grown. Calloway, at the end of the second week, stopping the truck on the road back to camp because a tire had gone soft. While he changed it, the women sat on the grass verge in the afternoon sun and waited. He did not tell them to stay. He did not watch them. He lay on his back in the gravel and worked the jack and periodically said things under his breath that appeared, from the tone and the cadence, to be directed at the tire rather than at anyone present. When he was done, he stood up and looked at the repair and said, "All right," to himself, and told them to get back in the truck. The whole exchange contained no performance of authority whatsoever. He had a flat tire, and he fixed it. They sat in the sun. Ilse had sat in the sun and felt. She filed the sensation carefully, looking for its accurate name, something she settled on as unthreatened. She had not felt unthreatened in 19 months. She did not mention this to Renata. 3 days later, Frank Dunlap had watched Ilse grate a batch of leaf for 20 minutes, and then said something to Wallace, who translated. "He says your eye is good. Wants to know if you worked with tobacco before." "No," Ilse said. Wallace translated. Frank Dunlap looked at her with a brief recalibration in his expression, not surprise, more the small internal adjustment of a man who has updated a prior estimate, and nodded and walked away. Renata appeared at Ilse's elbow. "What did he say?" "That my eye is good." "He's right," Renata said. Then, "Did you notice he said it like it was useful information? Not like a compliment. He's a practical man." "Yes." Renata paused. "But he told you. He didn't have to tell you. He could have just known it and kept moving. He told you because..." She stopped. "Because what?" Ilse said. Renata seemed to be working it out. "Because it was true and you were the person it was true about. So you should know it." She picked up her bundle. "That's a particular kind of respect. It doesn't cost anything, but you have to think to give it." Ilse said nothing. She placed her next bundle on the pile. She thought about the 45 seconds with Clara and the flat tire, and the coffee refilled without asking, and the soup distributed without pause between one category of person and the next. She thought about the accumulated weight of small moments that individually could each be explained and collectively were beginning to require an explanation she did not have. Her framework had not broken. She was precise about this. Each individual observation still fit inside it, if she held the observation at the right angle. Managed performance. Calculated decency. Investment in prisoner compliance. The framework was intact. What was changing was the effort required to keep it intact. What had once been automatic, receive observation, apply explanation, file, and move on, now required something more. A small but increasing expenditure of will. The explanations were still available. She simply had to reach for them now, where before they had arrived on their own. She did not know what to do with this information. She placed another bundle on the pile and said nothing and let the afternoon move. That evening, walking from the mess hall to the barracks in the last of the light, Renata said, "Clara asked me something today." Ilse looked at her. "In German?" "In the way you ask things without language." She held up her bundle and looked at me, and then looked at her hands and raised her eyebrows. "She was asking if you understood the technique." "I think she was asking if I was all right." Renata walked for a moment. "There's a difference." The valley was quiet in the warm evening. The apple orchard was past its bloom now, the petals gone, the first small fruit beginning. The rails at the perimeter were pale in the dusk, marking their low boundary between the camp and the rest of the world. "How do you know it wasn't just about the technique?" Ilse said. "Because she already knew I understood the technique. She watched me all afternoon. She knew." A pause. "She was checking on me. People check on each other. That's what that looks like." Ilse looked at the rails. She thought about the shape of the word people. The way Renata had used it. Not workers, not Americans, not any category. Just the word that contained everyone without distinction. She thought about her framework and its explanations and the increasing effort of maintaining them. She thought about the other path at the fork, the one she kept not taking, and where it led if she followed it honestly to the end. She did not follow it. Not yet. But she stood at the door of the barracks for a moment longer than necessary before going in, looking at the rails in the dusk and the orchard beyond them and the darkening shape of the blue ridge above the tree line. And something in the way she stood there was different from the way she had stood at the rails on the first day. She could not have named the difference precisely. She went inside. It was a Wednesday afternoon when Renata didn't come back from the far end of the orchard. The detail had been sent out after the midday meal to collect tools left from a morning pruning job. Shears and carrying baskets scattered across the eastern section of the orchard where the oldest trees grew. Wallace had pointed in the general direction and gone back inside. Calloway was near the truck reading something. The afternoon was warm, genuinely warm in the way that Virginia in May commits to warmth without reservation. The kind of afternoon that has a weight and a smell and a particular quality of light that presses gently on everything it touches. Ilse was working at the near end of the orchard with two other women. She could see Renata at the far end, moving between the trees, collecting the shears from the ground, and placing them in the basket she carried. Then she couldn't. Ilse noticed the absence the way she noticed most things, precisely and without initial interpretation. One moment Renata was between the fourth and fifth row of trees. The next moment the fourth and fifth row of trees had no one between them. Ilse kept working. She told herself Renata had moved to a row she couldn't see from this angle. She told herself the light was changing and the shadows between the trees were deep, and she had simply lost visual contact without it meaning anything. She carried a basket to the collection point near the shed and walked back and looked at the far end of the orchard with the specific quality of attention she applied to signals that had gone quiet unexpectedly. Nothing. She worked for another 20 minutes. The other two women moved through the near rows without noticing anything. Calloway was still at the truck. Wallace had not reappeared from the shed. Ilse put down her basket and walked to the far end of the orchard. The tools were there, the remaining shears on the ground. The basket Renata had been filling sitting between two tree roots with 3 pairs of shears in it. The work stopped where Renata had stopped, mid-task, without completion. Ilse looked past the last row of trees. The orchard ended at a low wooden rail, the same kind as the camp perimeter, the same weathered gray, the same suggestion of boundary without the substance of one. Beyond the rail, the land opened into a wide field of young grass running east toward a line of trees, perhaps 300 meters away. Beyond the trees, invisible from here, but inferable from the map Ilsa had been building since arrival, was a county road. Beyond the road, farmland. Beyond the farmland, the rest of Virginia, extending in every direction without meaningful interruption. In the soft earth just past the last tree root, there were boot prints. Small, heading east, already beginning to soften at the edges in the afternoon warmth, which told Ilsa they were perhaps 40 minutes old. She stood at the rail and looked at the prints and at the field and at the tree line 300 meters away. The afternoon was very quiet. Insects. Somewhere a bird she couldn't see. The distant sound of a tractor working in a field to the south. The blue ridge visible above the eastern tree line, its long ridge pale blue in the hazy afternoon air. Ilsa stood at the rail and did not move. She was calculating. She told herself she was calculating. The temperature, the terrain, the distance to the road, the distance from the road to the nearest town, which was Waynesboro, 14 miles north. Renata had no money. She had no English beyond a few words. She had no papers that would mean anything to a civilian who found her on a road in Virginia. The afternoon was warm, but the nights were still cool, and she had no coat. The calculation was straightforward. There was no scenario in which walking east across that field ended well for Renata. The numbers were clear. But Ilsa stood at the rail and did not turn around and report what she had found. She stood there and let the minutes move and tried to be honest with herself about why. The calculation was true. Every number in it was correct. And underneath the calculation, below the level where she kept her verified information and her reliable frameworks, there was something that was not a calculation at all. Something that had no unit of measurement and no place in any system she had ever operated inside. She was frightened for Renata, not of consequence, not of the administrative difficulty that Renata's absence would create, not of what it would mean for the group or for the work detail or for the conditions of their captivity. Frightened for Renata, for the specific person who had sat beside her in the warehouse and asked an unanswered question and read a worn paperback without being surprised by it, and said that's a particular kind of respect about a man who had simply told the truth. Ilsa stood at the low rail with the boot prints in the soft earth in front of her and understood, with the precision she applied to everything, that she was not going to report this immediately. She turned and walked back to the near end of the orchard and picked up her basket and resumed working. An hour passed. The shadows in the orchard shifted as the sun moved. The other two women finished their section and carried their baskets to the collection point. Calloway walked across the yard to speak to Wallace about the afternoon load. The ordinary movements of an ordinary afternoon continued around the space that Renata's absence occupied. Ilsa worked and calculated and watched the eastern end of the orchard and waited. She was waiting for the sound of boots in the grass, for a figure appearing between the last row of trees. She was constructing the scenario in careful detail. Renata returning, cold or muddy or both, having found nothing on the other side of the field except the distance and the road and the enormous indifferent afternoon, coming back through the trees with the specific expression of someone who has tested a question against reality and received the reality's answer. She was constructing this scenario with such precision that when a hand touched her shoulder, she dropped the shears. She turned. Calloway was standing behind her. He had approached from the direction of the truck with the quiet, unhurried movement that was simply how he moved. He looked at the shears on the ground, then at her face, then at the far end of the orchard. He said, in his careful German, "Where is the other one?" The question was simple. His face was simple. He was looking at her the way he looked at most things, with the focused neutrality of someone who needed accurate information in order to proceed and was asking the person most likely to have it. There was no accusation in it, no performance of authority, no implication about what the answer should be or what would follow from it. Just the question, held out toward her like a hand. Ilsa looked at him. She thought about 19 months of a system in which the honest answer to questions like this one had consequences she had learned not to ignore. She thought about the texture of those consequences, the specific weight of a system that required information and used the people who provided it and had no particular interest in their interior lives beyond their compliance. She looked at Calloway's face and could not find that system in it. "East," she said. "Through the orchard. 40 minutes ago, perhaps more." There is a rail at the far end. She went past it. Calloway looked at the eastern end of the orchard. He was quiet for a moment. How far to the road from that rail? 300 meters to the tree line. The road is beyond that. I don't know exactly how far. He nodded. He bent and picked up the shears she had dropped and placed them in her basket without comment. Then he walked east through the orchard at the same pace. He walked everywhere. Not running. Not urgent. The pace of a man who has assessed a situation and determined that urgency is not what the situation requires. Ilsa watched him disappear between the trees. She stood in the orchard with her basket and the afternoon light and the insects and the sound of the distant tractor and waited again. 40 minutes later, Calloway came back through the eastern tree line with Renata beside him. Renata was muddy from the knees down. Her hair had come loose. She was carrying her shoes in one hand, which meant she had crossed something wet, the low ground before the tree line. Ilsa guessed, where the spring water table was close to the surface. She was walking without difficulty, but with the particular interior quality of someone who has been somewhere and returned, and is still deciding what the going and returning meant. Calloway walked her across the yard to the farmhouse door. Marge appeared at the door, looked at Renata's legs, and stood back to let her in without a word. The door closed. Calloway stood in the yard for a moment. He looked at the farmhouse door. Then he turned and walked toward where Ilsa and the other two women were standing near the collection baskets, and said, in German, "We're loading in 20 minutes." That was all. Ilsa looked at him. Is she started. Marge has her, Calloway said. He said it the way you say something that is complete in itself and requires no addition. He walked to the truck. Ilsa stood in the yard. She was waiting for the rest of it, the assembly, the warning, the formal acknowledgement of what had happened and what it meant for the group. In every system she had operated inside, an event of this kind produced a response proportionate to its symbolic weight. You did not have a prisoner walk off a work detail and return without consequence and say nothing, because the saying nothing was itself a statement that the system could not afford to make. She waited. The 20 minutes passed. Marge brought Renata out through the farmhouse door with clean legs and a cup of something warm that Renata was still holding when she climbed into the truck. No assembly. No formal acknowledgement. No lesson administered. The women climbed in. The tailgate closed. Calloway drove. On the road back to camp, no one spoke for a long time. The valley moved past the canvas gap in the golden late afternoon light. The Blue Ridge was still visible to the west, its long ridge holding the last of the sun. Renata sat beside Ilsa with the cup. She had brought it from the farmhouse, the cup itself, which meant Marge had given it to her to keep warm on the ride, and looked out at the valley with the expression Ilsa had been trying to read since she appeared at the tree line. After a while, Ilsa said quietly, "What was there?" Renata didn't answer immediately. She looked at the valley. "A field," she said. "Then trees. Then the road. And the road." She paused. "Just a road. Empty in both directions. A bird on the wire above it. The mountains the same from that side as from this side." She looked down at the cup in her hands. "I stood on the road for a while. There was nothing to do there. There was nothing waiting. It was just a road in Virginia, and I was a person standing on it with no shoes because I hadn't planned the wet ground." Ilsa said nothing. "And then I thought about the shed," Renata said. "Clara's hands, and the way the bundle comes together when the stems are aligned. Marge's table. The coffee." A pause. "I thought about you. Me. Standing in the orchard. I knew you'd noticed. I knew you were standing there with my boot prints in front of you deciding what to do." She looked at Ilsa. "What did you do?" "I waited," Ilsa said. Renata looked at her for a moment. Then she looked back at the valley. "Why?" The question sat between them in the moving truck with the golden light coming through the canvas gap and the sound of the road under the wheels and the Blue Ridge going slowly past. Ilsa thought about the honest answer. She turned it over and examined it from the available angles and found that it had only one surface, no way to approach it that changed its shape. "Because I was frightened for you," she said. "Not of anything. For you." Renata was quiet. "That's not a calculation," she said. "No," Ilsa said. "It's the other thing." "Yes." They rode in silence for a while. The camp appeared in the shallow valley below them as the truck crested the low hill. The wooden buildings, the flagpole, the low rails at the perimeter pale in the evening light. Renata said, "He didn't punish me." "No." "Why not?" Ilsa looked at the camp coming toward them through the windshield gap. She thought about this honestly, the way she was trying now, increasingly, to think about things honestly rather than usefully. She thought about Calloway walking into the field without urgency and returning with Renata, and saying Marge has her with the completeness of a sentence that needed nothing added. She thought about the cup of something warm that Marge had given Renata to hold on the drive. She thought about a system confident enough in its own premise that it did not need to administer a lesson when the premise had already done the work. Because the road was empty in both directions, Ilsa said. And they knew it would be. Renata looked at her. They weren't confident we couldn't leave, Ilsa said slowly, the thought arriving in words as she spoke it rather than before. They were confident in what they had built, that we would find nothing out there worth the wet ground. She paused. That's different from a fence. A fence tells you that you can't leave. This tells you that you won't want to. The truck pulled into the camp and stopped. Calloway came around and dropped the tailgate, and the women climbed down into the Virginia evening. The air smelled of turned earth and apple, and the particular green smell of the valley after a warm day. The rails were pale at the perimeter. Beyond them the orchard was still, the new fruit dark on the branches in the last light. Renata handed the cup to Ilsa. Hold this, she said, and jumped down from the truck. Ilsa stood in the yard with Marge's cup in her hands, ceramic, heavy, still faintly warm from the drive, and looked at the camp around her. The wooden buildings. The flagpole. The ordinary evening movements of women returning from a work detail at the end of an ordinary day. She stood there for a moment longer than she needed to. Something in the framework had not broken. It had simply become insufficient. Too small for the ground it was meant to represent. The explanations were still available. She could still reach them. But standing in the Virginia evening with a borrowed cup in her hands, and the sound of Calloway closing the truck tailgate behind her, she found she had no particular desire to reach for them. She did not examine this at length. She carried the cup inside and set it on the shelf beside her bunk and sat down and looked at it in the last of the light. Outside, the valley settled into its evening. The Blue Ridge became a dark suggestion above the tree line and then disappeared into the dark entirely. The rails at the perimeter were invisible. The orchard was invisible. The road to the east was invisible, empty in both directions, exactly as Renata had found it. Ilsa sat on her bunk and looked at the cup and thought about what it meant that she was frightened for someone and had waited, and the system had absorbed the waiting without consequence, and a woman she barely knew had put something warm in a stranger's hands for a cold truck ride. She did not arrive at a conclusion, but she sat with the question longer than she had sat with any question in 19 months, and that itself was something she could measure. The news came in the morning. Calloway brought the paper to the mess hall and set it down without ceremony. Someone translated the headline. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The room stayed still. Ilsa read the line twice and felt something close to emptiness. Not relief and not sorrow. Just the strange flatness of a moment she had imagined too many times to recognize clearly when it arrived. Outside, the valley was already green. The orchard was in bloom. The camp looked exactly as it had the day before. Marge served breakfast the same way she always did. Same bowls. Same coffee. Same quiet hands. Ilsa watched her and understood that this was the point. Not a speech, not a lesson. Only the stubborn fact of ordinary life continuing. Later, Renata sat beside her and said, I thought it would feel louder. Ilsa looked out toward the rails. So did I, she said. Renata nodded once and said nothing else. Weeks later, when the women were finally sent east for repatriation, Ilsa carried with her a folded Virginia road map Marge had slipped into her bag without explanation. Back in Dresden, she pinned it above her work table. The city around her was broken and unfinished. Roads had to be redrawn. Blocks had to be measured again. And every time she looked at the map, she remembered the same thing. A country that did not need to shout what it was, because it had already built it into the ground.